I was lying in the recovery room at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto when my son-in-law walked in and dropped a manila envelope on my chest. Not beside me. On me. On the exact spot where the surgical dressing was still taped down over the incision where they had removed 2 lobes of my liver 6 hours earlier. I couldn't speak. The anesthetic hadn't fully worn off and my throat was raw from the breathing tube. I could only blink at him. At Gordon, this man I had welcomed into my family 11 years ago. This man I had defended to my own sister when she said he had cold eyes, and watch him cross his arms like he was waiting for a bus. "You should read that when you're feeling up to it," he said. "Take your time." He left before the nurse came back in. "I want to tell you what was in that envelope. But first you need to understand what I had just done, and why I had done it, and how long I had been doing it without anyone in that family ever asking me to stop. My daughter Vivian married Gordon Ashworth in September of 2013, at a vineyard outside Niagara-on-the-Lake. It was the kind of wedding that looked perfect in photographs. Gordon's mother, Rosalind, wore cream. Not ivory, cream practically white. And my ex-husband Harold whispered to me that she had done it on purpose, and I told him to be charitable. I was good at being charitable in those days. Gordon came from old Ontario money. Not flashy money, the kind that announces itself. The quiet kind. The kind that shows up in the form of a grandfather who endowed a building at Western University. A family cottage on Lake Joseph that had been in the Ashworth name since 1947. A last name that certain people in certain rooms would recognize and respond to with a particular nod. Vivian was a physiotherapist from Barrie. Her father drove a fuel truck. We were not the same kind of people, and Rosalind made sure we understood that without ever saying a single impolite word to our faces. But Vivian loved him. I watched her love him for 11 years. And Gordon? I thought he loved her back. He was quiet and a bit stiff, and he never once called me anything warmer than a deal. But I told myself that was just how he was raised. Some men don't warm up easily. Some men take time. What I didn't know, not until much later, was that Gordon had been planning his exit for at least 3 of those 11 years. Vivian and Gordon had been trying to have a baby since 2018. It didn't happen. There were appointments and procedures and a miscarriage in the spring of 2020 that Vivian called me about at 11 o'clock at night. And I drove 2 hours from Barrie to their condo in Midtown Toronto in a February ice storm and held her. While Gordon sat in the kitchen with the lights off. She had 2 more after that. Each time something in her got a little quieter. Each time Gordon got a little more absent. I noticed. I said nothing because what was there to say? Then in the fall of 2022, Rosalind was diagnosed with primary sclerosing cholangitis. It's a liver disease. Progressive, serious, and in her case advanced enough that her specialist at Toronto General put her on the transplant waiting list within a few months of diagnosis. The prognosis without a transplant was not good. Gordon was devastated. I saw something real in him for the first time in years. Genuine fear, genuine grief. His mother was his anchor. Whatever else he was, he loved Rosalind. I said I would be tested. I know how that sounds. I know that some of you reading this are already asking why. Rosalind had never been warm to me. She had spent 11 years finding subtle ways to remind Vivian that she had married down. But Vivian adored her mother-in-law. She genuinely did. The way some daughters-in-law manage to love difficult women. And Gordon was my daughter's husband, and Rosalind was the grandmother of the children. Vivian still hoped to have someday, and I was 53 years old and healthy, and I had 2 perfectly functional liver lobes, and a specialist had told me that living donor liver donation was possible and that donors recovered well. I said I would be tested. The workup took 4 months. It is not a simple process. It is a blood draw, and then another blood draw, and then imaging, and then more imaging, and then a psychological evaluation, and then a meeting with the transplant coordinator, and then a meeting with the surgeon, and then another meeting with the surgeon. They test your blood type, your liver volume, your anatomy, the way your vessels branch, your mental health history, your motivations. They want to make sure you understand what you are agreeing to. They want to make sure no one is forcing you. No one was forcing me. I passed every screening. I was, the transplant coordinator told me in a very cheerful email, an excellent candidate. My blood type was compatible. My anatomy was favorable. My liver volume was more than sufficient. We scheduled the surgery for March of the following year. Gordon cried when I told him, actual tears, in my kitchen in Barry, standing by the counter where I had made him coffee he'd never finished. He said, Adil, I don't know how we'll ever repay you. He said, you're saving her life. He said, we're family. I believed him. In the weeks before the surgery, I got my affairs in order the way they ask you to. I updated my will. I arranged for a neighbor to water my plants. I told my sister Paulette, and my friend Barbara and I did not tell anyone else because I didn't want a fuss. My daughter knew, obviously. She was terrified for me. She held my hand in the pre-op waiting room and said, Mom, you don't have to do this, and I said I know. And that was the end of that conversation because we both knew I was going to do it anyway. The surgery was 7 hours. They took the right lobe of my liver, about 60% of the total volume, and transplanted it into Rosalind in a room down the hall. I was told everything went smoothly. I was told the graft was functioning. I was in the recovery room by early evening. I was still in that recovery room, not yet moved to my own room, still connected to the IV and the monitoring equipment, and feeling like my entire midsection had been turned inside out, when Gordon walked in. He was wearing the same clothes he'd had on in the waiting room. He'd been there all day. I'd been told that he was there, that he was waiting. I had assumed he was waiting because he's worried about me, because I had just given a major portion of my internal organ structure to keep his mother alive. He put the envelope on my chest. He said, take your time. He left. The nurse came back, saw the envelope, looked at me, looked at the envelope, said, do you want me to open that for you? And I said yes because I genuinely could not lift my arms very well yet. She opened it, she read the front page. Her face did something that she immediately controlled back into professional neutrality, and she handed it to me and I read it. It was a petition for divorce, filed on behalf of Gordon Ashworth, citing irreconcilable differences. My daughter did not yet know. She was still in the family waiting room down the hall, thinking we had all just been through something terrible and sacred together. There was a post-it note stuck to the front page in Gordon's handwriting. It said, please don't make this harder than it needs to be. I have thought about that note a great deal since then. The casual cruelty of it. The assumption that he was the one for whom this might be hard. He had just watched the woman who raised his wife be cut open on an operating table to save his mother, and he had spent that entire 7 hours, apparently finalizing paperwork with a lawyer, and then he had walked into the recovery room and placed that paperwork on my surgical dressing and told me not to make it difficult. He had been seeing someone else for 2 years. Her name was Tara. She worked at the same investment firm where Gordon was a partner. I didn't know any of that yet. I would learn it in pieces over the following weeks. What I knew in that moment was that my daughter was down the hall, and she did not yet know her marriage was over, and I was lying in a hospital bed with a drain in my side and a 7-inch incision, and I could not get up and go to her. I pressed the nurse call button. I told the nurse who came that I needed my daughter, that I needed her in this room. The nurse said she would get her. Vivienne came in looking pale and exhausted, and she saw my face and she knew something was wrong before I said a single word. She's always been able to read me. 28 years of being my daughter and she can still do it. I held out the papers. She read them standing up, which I'm still not sure how she managed, and then she sat down in the chair beside my bed very slowly, the way someone sits when their legs have stopped working properly, and she said, Mom. And I said, I know. And that was all either of us said for a very long time. Here is where I have to be honest with you about something. In the first few days after surgery, when I was still in hospital and in significant pain and could not eat properly, and could not turn over in bed without it, feeling like my insides were tearing, my primary emotion was not rage. It was grief. I grieved for Vivienne, for the life she had thought she was building, for the babies she'd lost and the mother-in-law she'd loved, and the future that had been quietly cancelled without her knowledge. I grieved for myself a little, though that felt self-indulgent in comparison. Rosalind was in the same hospital, 2 floors up I was told. She was doing well, the graft was taking, her numbers were improving, she was expected to make a full recovery. I asked the nurse, somewhat flatly, whether Rosalind knew what had happened. The nurse didn't know. I said nothing more about it. Gordon did not come back to see me. Not that day, not the next day, not at any point during my 8-day hospital stay. Tara, I would later learn, had been waiting for him in a hotel near the hospital. He had gone directly from my recovery room to her. Rosalind, as it turned out, did know about the divorce. She had known for months. Gordon had told her in January. She had said nothing to Vivienne, nothing to me, nothing during the 4 months of testing and preparation and scheduling. She had accepted the surgery date, attended the pre-operative family meetings, sat in that waiting room for 7 hours, and said nothing. My sister Paulette, who has never once in her life been charitable about anyone, would later say, "She took your liver and kept her mouth shut." I told her that wasn't fair. Paulette said, "Adele, she took your liver and kept her mouth shut. I have not resolved how I feel about Rosalind. I don't think I ever fully will. What I know is what came next. On the 4th day of my hospital stay, I had a visit from Dr. Ewan, not my surgeon but the transplant coordinator I had worked with throughout the screening process. She came in with a look on her face that I had not seen before, something careful and precise. And she sat down and asked how I was feeling. And I said fine. And she said she had something she needed to discuss with me. She told me that during the post-operative review process, a discrepancy had been flagged in the compatibility documentation. I did not understand what that meant at first. She explained it to me slowly. During my original screening, a comprehensive compatibility panel had been run. Not just blood type, but tissue typing, antibody screening. The full range of tests they use to determine whether a donor organ is appropriate for a specific recipient. My results had come back with some findings that should have prompted a second conversation with the transplant team about recipient suitability. That conversation had not happened. Instead, the results in the system showed a clean compatibility profile, results that, upon audit, did not match what the original lab had produced. Someone had altered my compatibility documents. I asked her to say that again. She said it again. My compatibility documents. The records that showed I was a suitable donor specifically for Rosalind Ashworth had been modified. The original results showed some concerns around certain antibody markers that would have, in Dr. N's careful language, warranted further discussion about whether I was the right donor for this particular recipient. Those concerns had been removed from the records that reached the transplant committee, which meant that someone had deliberately falsified medical records to ensure that my surgery went forward, regardless of whether it was the medically appropriate choice for Rosalind. My liver had still been transplanted. The graft was still functioning. Rosalind's body appeared to be accepting it, but the risk profile of the transplant had been different from what the committee had approved, and that had happened because someone had interfered with the documentation. There was an investigation. It was already underway. I asked who had access to alter those records. Dr. Yoon was very careful. She said that was part of what was being examined. I lay there in that hospital bed with the drain still in my side, and the surgical wound still tender, and I thought about Gordon crying in my kitchen in Barrie. About the way he had said, "We're family." The investigation took 6 weeks. I was home by then, recovering slowly the way you do after that kind of surgery. Tired in a way that goes all the way through you. Not able to drive for the first month, eating carefully, doing the breathing exercises the physiotherapist had given me. Vivienne stayed with me for the first 3 weeks. She slept in my spare room and made me soup. I didn't really want and cried in the bathroom when she thought I couldn't hear her. I let her think I couldn't hear her. Gordon had moved out of their condo and was staying at his and Tara's new place, a rental in Rosedale, naturally. By the time the investigation concluded, the findings were significant. A clinic administrator with ties to the Ashworth family had accessed the transplant database and altered 3 fields in my compatibility report. This was not a small thing. This was a criminal code matter. This was fraud in relation to medical records. This was potentially criminal negligence. This was, as the lawyer I hired in week 2 told me very directly, a serious case. Gordon claimed he knew nothing about it. His lawyers were very emphatic about this claim. He said Rosalind had acted without his knowledge. Rosalind's position, delivered through her own legal team from her recovery suite, was somewhat different. She said she had been told by Gordon that there was a concern about the compatibility results, and that he had said he would handle it, and that she had not asked questions because she was ill and frightened, and her son had told her it would be fine. Neither of them looked particularly good in this story. That is the most neutral way I can put it. Here is what the investigation could establish. The records had been altered. The individual who altered them had done so following a series of phone calls from a number associated with an Ashworth family account. The timing of those calls was documented. Their content was not. They were voice calls, not texts, not emails, nothing written. Here is what the investigation could not establish, at least not beyond the standard required for criminal charges. Who had specifically instructed the alteration to happen? So what we had was the administrator, who pled guilty to a charge under the criminal code and received a suspended sentence. And we had Gordon and Rosalind, against whom the evidence was strong enough to make their lawyers extremely busy. But, not strong enough, my own lawyer told me, for criminal charges at that stage of the investigation. My lawyer, whose name is Sandra Chen, and who is one of the sharpest people I have ever met, told me that the civil route was a different matter entirely. I am not a litigious person. I want to be clear about that. I grew up in a family where you handled your problems quietly, and you didn't air things in public, and you certainly didn't sue anyone. My mother would have considered a lawsuit a form of social disgrace, roughly equivalent to going on television and talking about your personal life. But I sat in Sandra Chen's office in a building on Bay Street, and I listened to her explain what had happened to me, and what the legal options were, and I thought about lying in that hospital bed reading those divorce papers while my surgical dressing was still being held down with tape. And I said, let's go. We filed a civil suit against Gordon Ashworth, Rosalind Ashworth, and the clinic administrator. The claims included fraud, negligent misrepresentation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Sandra also filed against the clinic itself, on the basis that their data security had been inadequate, and their oversight processes had failed to catch the alteration. It took 14 months. These things take time. I went back to my life. I went back to work in the spring, about 3 months after surgery, part-time at first and then full-time by summer. I walked every morning along Kempenfelt Bay. I had dinner with Paulette every second Sunday. I watched Vivienne slowly, painfully, begin to put herself back together, begin to see a therapist, begin to go out with friends again, begin to talk about Gordon in the past tense rather than as if he were a wound that was still open. She is stronger than she knows, she always has been. Gordon and Tara got engaged. I know because Paulette saw it on LinkedIn of all places. I chose not to have any feelings about this. The settlement came 14 months after we filed. I am not able to share the specific terms. There's a confidentiality clause, which Sandra warned me about from the beginning. What I can tell you is that the settlement was substantial. What I can tell you is that the clinic's insurance carrier, when presented with the full documentation of what had happened on their systems and the downstream consequences was extremely motivated to resolve the matter. What I can tell you is that Gordon Ashworth's lawyers spent a great deal of those 14 months trying to limit his personal liability, and that they were not entirely successful. What I can also tell you is that the Toronto General Transplant Program conducted a full internal audit as a result of this case, and updated their documentation verification protocols, and that Dr. Yun wrote to me personally to say that she was sorry for what had happened and that the program had learned from it. I kept that letter. It's in a drawer in my bedroom. I look at it sometimes. Rosalind Ashworth is alive. Her transplant, my liver lobe, the 60% of my liver that I gave to her when she was a woman I did not particularly like but whose death I could have prevented, is functioning. Her last update, which I received through the hospital transplant program's routine follow-up process, indicated stable liver function. I did not do what I did for Rosalind. I need to be honest about that. I did it for Vivienne, and I did it because I could, and I did it because I am the kind of person who, when faced with a situation where I can help, finds it very difficult to walk away. That is not always a virtue. My sister would tell you it has gotten me into trouble before. But I will also tell you this. I don't regret the surgery. I know that sounds strange. I regret everything else. The deception, the documents, the envelope on my chest, the 7 hours Gordon spent with a lawyer while I was in an operating room. I regret all of that deeply. But I don't regret that Rosalind is alive. Whatever she did, whatever she allowed to happen, she is a person and she is alive. And if I had known then what I know now, I honestly don't know that I would have made a different choice. What I do know is that I would have had better lawyers involved from the beginning. Vivian is seeing someone now. His name is Callum. She told me on the phone last month, and she said it the way you say something you've been holding for a while and finally decided to put down. She said he's kind. She said he asks her questions and actually listens to the answers. She said he made her laugh at a farmer's market in Kensington for the first time in she didn't know how long. I said good, and she said I know, Mom, and we both understood what we meant. I turned 56 in November. I am in good health. My liver has regenerated to approximately 90% of its original volume, which is what livers do. They are remarkable that way, and one of the reasons living donor transplant is possible at all. I walk every morning. I have dinner with Paulette. I had my kitchen repainted in a color called pale straw, and I think it was the right decision. Gordon Ashworth and Tara got married in June. A small ceremony, I was told, again through Paulette, who monitors LinkedIn with the dedication of a professional intelligence analyst. Rosalind was there, apparently. She is well enough to attend weddings now, which is, objectively, because of me. I have chosen to be at peace with that. It took a while, but I got there. There is one thing I think about sometimes, lying awake in the quiet way you do when you're over 50 and sleep comes and goes at its own schedule. I think about Gordon standing in my recovery room, envelope in hand, and I wonder what he thought was going to happen. I wonder if he thought I would sign the papers quietly and go back to Barry and never say another word about it. I wonder if he assumed that I was the kind of woman who had given enough, been through enough, and would simply fold. He miscalculated. I was a fuel truck driver's wife from Barry who had just spent 7 hours on an operating table and come out the other side, and I was not going to fold. I had Sandra Chen's number in my phone before I was discharged from St. Michael's. I had the name of a forensic document examiner before the end of the week. I had, in the 14 months that followed, every single piece of paper they had ever generated, every phone record they had produced in discovery, every email their lawyers tried to redact and couldn't fully hide. I have never been the kind of woman who makes things hard for no reason. But when someone gives me a reason, when someone places a reason directly on my surgical dressing and tells me to take my time, I find I am quite capable of making things very hard indeed. Vivian called me last Sunday. She called to say she and Callum were coming up to Barry for the long weekend, and she wanted to know if I would make the lemon cake. The one with the cream cheese frosting, the one she's been asking me to make since she was 9 years old. I said of course. She said she loved me. I said I loved her too. I made the cake. It was a good weekend. The bay was very still on Saturday morning, and the light came through the kitchen window the way it does in October, and I stood there with my coffee and I thought, I am still here. My daughters is still here. We got through it. That's the whole story. That's all of it. I wanted you to hear it from me.